There's someone in your life you can't stand. You know exactly who I'm talking about. Their face just surfaced in your mind. Maybe it's a coworker who takes credit for everything, a family member whose voice alone tightens something in your chest, an ex-partner, a public figure, a stranger you've never met but whose posts make your blood simmer. You tell yourself it's justified. They're arrogant, selfish, fake, weak. They're everything that's wrong with people. But here's what's strange. Other people encounter this same person and feel nothing, neutral, indifferent. They shrug and move on. But you can't let it go. You replay conversations. You rehearse arguments in the shower. You feel a physical reaction, tension in your jaw, a tightness in your stomach, even when just thinking about them. This is not a casual dislike. This is activation. The psychoanalyst Carl Jung spent decades studying this phenomenon. He noticed something peculiar in his patients. The traits they most despised in others were often the very traits they refused to see in themselves. Not similar traits, the same traits. In his book, Ion researches into the phenomenology of the self, Jung wrote, "Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. The world becomes a replica of your own unknown face. The people who trigger you most are not random. They are mirrors, distorted, unwelcome, undeniable, reflecting back the parts of yourself you've buried so deep you no longer recognize them as yours." The poet Robert Bly gave this a visceral image. In his slim but devastating book, A Little Book on the Human Shadow, he wrote, "We spend our life, until we're 20, deciding what parts of ourselves to put into the bag, and we spend the rest of our lives trying to get them out again. The bag is Bly's metaphor for everything you've rejected about yourself, every trait that got you punished, shamed, or excluded as a child. You stuffed it into this invisible bag and dragged it behind you, out of sight, out of consciousness, but not out of existence. The contents of that bag don't disappear. They ferment. They grow strange in the dark, and they find their way out, not through your own behavior, but through your perception of others. You don't see people as they are. You see people through the filter of everything you've refused to be. Here's an example you'll recognize. You meet someone who's loud and self-promotional. They dominate conversations. They brag. They seem to believe they're the most important person in any room. And something inside you recoils. You judge them instantly. You label them narcissist, show-off, insufferable. You can't understand how anyone tolerates them. You might even feel morally superior for not being like that. But what if your reaction is so intense precisely because, somewhere in the basement of your psyche, there's a version of you that wants to be seen? A version that learned, long ago, that wanting attention was shameful, that self-promotion was ugly, that confidence was arrogance. So you killed that part of yourself. You exiled it. You became humble, modest, self-effacing, because that was safe. And now, when you see someone living out the confidence you murdered in yourself, you don't feel neutral. You feel fury. This is what Jung called the shadow. Not a monster, not a demon, but the unlived life within you. The sum of everything you could have been, might have been, were told not to be. And the shadow doesn't stay hidden forever. It projects. So why you? The world is filled with difficult people, manipulative, selfish, arrogant, cruel. You pass hundreds of them every week, and most of them don't register. They're background noise, neutral data, but certain people, certain types, hook you. They grab you by the nervous system. You find yourself thinking about them when they're not around. They hijack your attention and your emotions, and you construct elaborate internal narratives about their flaws. This isn't observation. This is obsession. And obsession is never about the other person. Here's how you know. Think about your reaction, not the judgment itself, the intensity of it, the heat, the grip. Here's the tell, the emotional charge. Something happens, small, forgettable, and an hour later you're still composing your response, still rehearsing what you'd say, your body tightening over something that should have passed in seconds. This charge, the disproportionate intensity, is the signature of the shadow. When your response to a stimulus exceeds what the situation warrants, it tells you, this isn't about them. This is about something in you that remains unfaced. The Jungian analyst James Hollis puts it bluntly in Why Good People Do Bad Things. The more we remain unconscious of our shadow, the darker and denser it becomes, and the more we project it onto others. Read this carefully. What you do not know about yourself or refuse to face, you will encounter through projection. You will see it in others. You will hate it in others. You will fight it in others. And you will never defeat it, because you're fighting a ghost, a reflection, an echo of your own disowned self, dressed in someone else's face. But here's what makes it worse. The shadow isn't some foreign invader. It isn't a demon that possessed you. It isn't something that was done to you. Carl Jung explains this in his book, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. The shadow personifies everything that the subject refuses to acknowledge about himself, and yet is always thrusting itself upon him, directly or indirectly. The shadow personifies everything that the subject refuses to acknowledge about himself, and yet is always thrusting itself upon him, directly or indirectly. In other words, your shadow isn't alien, it isn't foreign. It's you, the parts of you that you've pushed out of awareness, the traits that could be conscious if you were willing to look. But you're not willing. And so they stay in the dark. And from the dark, they shape everything. Your relationships, your choices, your enemies, your attractions, your entire experience of reality. Let me explain this plainly. The people you hate are carrying something that belongs to you. Every time you point a finger in accusation, 3 fingers point back. This isn't a cliche. It's a psychological law. It's the architecture of the human mind. And until you understand this, you will keep fighting the wrong enemy. You will keep projecting your wounds onto the world and wondering why the world never seems to heal. You will call it fate. Jung would call it unconsciousness. So here's the question you've never asked. What if the problem was never them? What if the intensity of your reaction has nothing to do with them and everything to do with you? What if this emotional charge is a signal from your own psyche? What if your hatred is a message? This is where most people stop. This is where the ego intervenes, where the defense mechanisms kick in, where you tell yourself, this doesn't apply to me. I'm not like that. I know who I am. And that voice, that certain defensive, self-protective voice, is exactly how the shadow stays hidden. It's a perfect trap, a prison designed by the prisoner. But if you're still here, if something in you recognizes the truth beneath this discomfort, then you're standing at a threshold. Behind you is the life you've been living, the stories you've told yourself, the certainty of who you think you are. And ahead is a door you've never opened, a room you've never entered, a version of yourself you abandoned so long ago you forgot it ever existed. Let me show you where the shadow came from. The shadow didn't appear out of nowhere. It has an origin, and that origin has your fingerprints all over it. Let's go meet someone you've spent your whole life avoiding. Yourself. You were not born divided. Watch any infant, any toddler, and you'll see the entire spectrum of human emotion expressed without any filter. Joy, rage, jealousy, tenderness, aggression, grief, wonder. They cycle through these states like weather systems, each one total, each one owned. A toddler doesn't wonder if their anger makes them a bad person. They simply are what they feel, moment to moment, without the elaborate machinery of self-censorship that you now take for granted. They have no shadow, not yet. Jung understood that the shadow is not something you're born with. It's something that gets constructed, piece by piece, rejection by rejection, wound by wound, throughout your childhood through what he called the process of socialization. The architects of your shadow were not villains. They were parents, teachers, coaches, peers, even culture itself, people who loved you, people who were themselves fractured, passing their fractures on to you like a genetic inheritance of the soul. The psychologist Carl Rogers called this process the development of conditions of worth. Children are not loved unconditionally. They learn, very early, that love and approval depend on meeting certain standards. Be this, don't be that. Act this way, never act that way. In his landmark work, Client-Centered Therapy, Rogers wrote, "The infant learns to need love, to enjoy it, to behave in ways that produce it, and to avoid behaviors which result in the withholding of love. The child learns to abandon their own experience, their own instincts, desires, emotions, in exchange for approval. This is the original fracture. Here's how it works. Picture yourself at 6 years old. You're angry at your sibling. Maybe they broke your toy. Maybe they got more attention from your parents. It doesn't matter. You feel a surge of anger, real, primal anger, and you express it. Maybe you hit your sibling. Maybe you scream. Maybe you simply say something with too much force. And the response comes, "We don't act like that. Good children don't do that. What's wrong with you?" In that moment, a calculation happens, faster than conscious thought. The equation is simple and brutal. This part of me threatens my survival. Anger is not safe. Anger makes people withdraw their love. Anger threatens your survival because to a child, parental love is survival. So you do what any intelligent organism does with a threat. You eliminate it. Except you can't eliminate parts of yourself. You can only exile them. So you take that emotion, that anger, that natural, human, necessary capacity, and you bury it into the darkness, into the bag, into the shadow. Swiss psychoanalyst Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's closest collaborator, writes in Man and His Symbols, "The shadow is not the whole of the unconscious personality. It is the unknown or little-known attributes and qualities of the ego, everything that has not been admitted into consciousness. You don't get to choose what goes into the shadow. The culture you were born into chooses this for you. If you were raised in a family that valued stoicism, your vulnerability went into the shadow. If you were raised to be nurturing and self-sacrificing, your healthy aggression went into the shadow. If you were raised religious, your sexuality, your doubt, your rebellion, it all goes in shadow. Each exile was a survival strategy. Each one cost you a piece of yourself. Here's the cruelest part. The shadow is not composed only of darkness. Yes, it contains your capacity for rage, for cruelty, for selfishness, for destruction, but it also contains your unlived life, your murdered potential, the person you might have become if you hadn't been trained out of it." Jung made this distinction clearly. In his book, Psychology and Religion, West and East, he wrote, "The shadow is merely somewhat inferior, primitive, unadapted, and awkward, not wholly bad. It even contains childish or primitive qualities which would in a way vitalize and embellish human existence. Your shadow might contain the artist you were told was impractical, the leader you were told was too bossy, The lover you were told was too intense. The rebel you were told was too dangerous. Jung called this the golden shadow, which we'll discuss later, the positive potential we've disowned because it too threatened our belonging. You didn't just repress your darkness, you repressed your light, and this is why the shadow carries such charge. When you encounter someone living out a quality you've exiled, whether that quality is aggression or ambition, sexuality or sensitivity, dominance or vulnerability, you don't see a person. You see a traitor. Someone who got away with what you were punished for. Someone who refused to sacrifice what you sacrificed. Someone who kept what you were forced to throw away. And this feels unbearable. To understand the shadow, you must understand its opposite, the persona. Jung borrowed the term from ancient Greek theater, where persona referred to the mask actors wore on stage. Your persona is the mask you present to the world, the face you show the world, the curated self, the version of you designed for public consumption, the good employee, the caring parent, the loyal friend, the humble servant, the person who has it all together. Everyone has a persona. It's necessary. You can't walk through society showing everyone the full chaos of your inner world. The persona is adaptive, functional, protective. But here's where it becomes a trap. Most people don't just wear their persona, they become it. They wear the mask so long they forget it's a mask. They mistake the performance for the performer. They think the curated self is the self. And the more identified you become with your persona, the deeper your shadow grows. Imagine a seesaw. On one side, everything you want to show, your virtues, your carefully constructed identity, your persona. On the other side, everything you hide, the rage, the lust, the envy, the pettiness, the hunger, the parts that don't match the image, your shadow. The higher you elevate your persona, the lower your shadow is forced to go. The more you insist on your goodness, the more your darkness gets driven underground, and the more energy it accumulates in the dark. This is why the most righteous people often carry the deepest shadows. The public moralist caught in scandal, the spiritual leader exposed for abuse, the perfect family that implodes, the saint who turns out to be a predator. These aren't anomalies. They're the inevitable consequence of a bloated persona, an identity so inflated with virtue that the shadow had nowhere to go but down, and down, until it exploded upward. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly. In Psychology and Religion, he wrote, "Unfortunately, there can be no doubt that man is, on the whole, less good than he imagines himself, or wants to be. The person who insists they have no darkness is the person most possessed by it." Even Sigmund Freud understood this dynamic. Freud called this repression, the process by which unacceptable thoughts, memories, and impulses are pushed out of conscious awareness. In his book, The Ego and the Id, he wrote, "The repressed is only cut off sharply from the ego by the resistances of repression. It can communicate with the ego through the id. The repressed doesn't disappear. It finds other routes. It communicates in disguise, through dreams, through slips of the tongue, through symptoms, through projections." Jung expanded on this, where Freud focused primarily on repressed sexual and aggressive instincts. Jung saw the shadow as containing anything that didn't fit the conscious self-image. The shadow is not just your inner monster, it's your inner stranger. The tragedy is this: most people defend their persona with their lives. They've invested everything in it: their relationships, their careers, their self-esteem, all built on the foundation of, "This is who I am." To admit the shadow exists is to admit the persona is incomplete, partial, a lie of omission, and that feels like death. So they double down, they project, they point at others and say, "That's not me. I would never." And the more they protest, the more they reveal exactly where their shadow lives. The analyst James Hollis writes in The Middle Passage. Carl Jung writes in Psychology and Religion. A man who is possessed by his shadow is always standing in his own light and falling into his own traps. This is the trap, the perfect employee who rages at the incompetent coworker, the devoted mother who despises the neglectful parent down the street, the spiritual seeker who judges the unconscious masses, the moral crusader who attacks the corrupt opposition. Each of them is defending a persona. Each of them is projecting a shadow. Each of them is fighting themselves in the mirror and losing. And here's what Jung understood that most people never grasp. The shadow doesn't stay contained. It can't. It's too alive, too dynamic, too hungry for expression. Remember, exiled things don't die. They ferment. They grow strange in the darkness. And they find a way out. You can't repress something forever. The pressure builds. The exiled parts of you don't sit quietly in the darkness, waiting to be forgotten. They push. They leak. They seep through the cracks of your carefully constructed self. And if they can't escape through your actions, they escape through your perception. They crawl out of you and onto the faces of others. This is the mechanism that runs your life without your knowledge. This is how your inner war becomes an outer war. This is projection. There's a mechanism running beneath your conscious mind. It operates without your permission, without your awareness, without your consent. It's called projection. The term comes from Freud, but Jung developed it into something far more profound. Here's what it looks like in practice. You don't feel your own rage. You see other people as threatening. You don't acknowledge your own greed. You notice it everywhere in others. You don't face your own hunger for power. You become obsessed with calling out the power-hungry. The shadow, the disowned parts of you don't sit still. They can't. They need somewhere to go. They project. They find hosts. They land on other people who carry even a trace of what you've buried. Projection is not metaphor. It's not poetry. It's a documented psychological process with a precise function to maintain the ego's self-image by externalizing what threatens it. Let me show you exactly how this works. Take selfishness. Everyone has selfish impulses. It's wired into survival. It's part of being human. But let's say your early environment taught you that selfishness was unacceptable, shameful, worthy of punishment or withdrawal of love. So you repressed it. You built an identity around generosity, around sacrifice, around putting others first. And it worked. The selfish impulse went quiet, but it didn't go away. Now, years later, you're an adult. You encounter someone who displays selfish behavior. Maybe they look out for themselves. Maybe they say no without explaining. Maybe they prioritize their needs. And your nervous system activates. Your unconscious recognizes its own exiled quality, but the ego cannot tolerate this recognition. So instead of thinking, "I see something of myself in them," the psyche performs a sleight of hand. It projects the disowned trait outward. You see a villain, an enemy, a symbol of everything wrong with the world. This emotional charge you feel, this intense, disproportionate emotional reaction, is the energy of your own repression redirected outward. The Jungian analyst Liliane Freiron explains it precisely in From Freud to Jung. Projection is an unconscious, autonomous process whereby contents of one's own unconscious are perceived in other persons. Unconscious, autonomous. You don't choose it. You don't control it. It happens to you beneath the threshold of awareness. And this is what makes it so insidious. You never suspect you're doing it. The projection feels like clear perception. The other person really seems to be what you're projecting onto them. Your hatred feels justified. Your judgment feels accurate. Your moral superiority feels earned. But in reality, it's all a mirror, all smoke and glass. Now here's where it gets more insidious. Projection doesn't create something from nothing. The person you're projecting onto usually does possess some measure of the trait you're seeing. Your coworker might actually be somewhat arrogant. Your ex was somewhat selfish. Your father did have a cruel streak. But projection takes that sliver of truth and inflates it, warps it, turns a flaw into a verdict, a trait into an identity, a human into a monster. What's actually 10% becomes 100% of what you see. And the 90% comes from your own shadow. You never notice. You never question. You walk through life convinced that your perceptions are neutral. Jung put it bluntly in The Philosophical Tree. A man who is unconscious of himself acts in a blind, instinctive way, and is in addition fooled by all the illusions that arise when he sees everything that he is not conscious of in himself coming to meet him from outside as projections upon his neighbor. Read that again. Everything you are not conscious of in yourself comes to meet you from the outside. The people you hate, the people who trigger you, the people you can't stop thinking about, complaining about, raging about, they are not your enemies. They are information. They are arrows pointing inward. They are carrying pieces of your psyche, pieces you threw away, pieces you denied, pieces you tried to kill. They are your shadow waving at you from someone else's face. So here's where we are. You now understand that the shadow is not your enemy. It's your unlived self. You understand how it was created. You understand the persona you built to compensate and how fiercely you defend it. And you understand the mechanism of projection, how your unconscious takes what you can't face and paints it onto the world, onto other people, convincing you that the problem is out there. But understanding is not integration. Knowing about the shadow is not the same as confronting it. The question is, are you ready to look in the mirror? Let's get specific. You've understood the theory. Now let's see it in your actual life, in the people who trigger you, in the traits you despise, in the faces you can't get out of your head. Each one is a mirror. Each one is holding something that belongs to you. You know this person. They walk into a room and take up space. They speak with certainty. They don't apologize. They seem to believe without question that they matter. And something in you tightens. You label them instantly. Narcissist, egomaniac, full of themselves. But here's the question you don't want to ask. When did you decide that confidence was a crime? Jung identified what's actually happening here. He called it the projection of the mana personality, the powerful, authoritative self you've disowned. In 2 essays on analytical psychology, he wrote, "Whoever identifies with the persona has an unconscious counterposition which takes revenge in the form of moods, affects, and phobias." In simple terms, the confidence you killed doesn't disappear. It haunts you from the outside. Think back. Were you told not to brag? Was pride a sin in your household? Did you learn that taking up space was dangerous? That being seen invited attack? So you made yourself smaller, quieter, humble, and you called it virtue. But Alfred Adler, the founder of individual psychology, understood the cost. What we suppress doesn't vanish, it inverts. The exiled will to power becomes an inferiority complex, and that inferiority complex makes other people's confidence feel like a personal attack. You don't hate arrogant people because they're wrong. You hate them because they kept what you were forced to throw away. You despise laziness. You pride yourself on discipline, output, relentless forward motion. You can't stand people who coast, who rest, who seem content to simply be. But here's what's strange. Jung didn't pathologize rest. He insisted on it. In the Red Book, he wrote about the necessity of stillness, of allowing the unconscious to speak, of resisting the modern compulsion toward constant activity. He called productive obsession a form of possession. So why do you despise someone who is lazy? Because somewhere along the way, your worth got welded to your output. Slowing down feels like failure. Rest feels like death. The analyst and theologian Thomas Moore writes in Care of the Soul, "The great malady of the 20th century is loss of soul. When soul is neglected, it doesn't just go away. It appears symptomatically in obsessions, addictions, violence, and loss of meaning. Your hatred of laziness is the symptom. The person you call lazy isn't broken. They've preserved something you've lost, the ability to stop without shame. You don't despise their laziness. You envy their peace. You pride yourself on generosity. You give, you sacrifice. You put others first, always. And you judge selfish people harshly, the ones who say no, the ones who prioritize themselves, the ones who take without apology. But Jung saw something most people miss. He argued that healthy selfishness is not the enemy of love. It's the prerequisite. In his book on individuation, called On the Nature of the Psyche, he wrote, "Individuation does not shut one out from the world, but gathers the world to oneself. You cannot give from an empty cup. You cannot love others while abandoning yourself. The self-sacrifice you've performed isn't virtue. It's self-erasure wearing virtue's mask." Erich Fromm made the distinction sharp in The Art of Loving. Selfishness and self-love, far from being identical, are actually opposites. The selfish person does not love himself too much, but too little. In fact, he hates himself. The person you despise for their selfishness has something you've forbidden yourself, a relationship with their own needs. You're exhausted. You abandoned your own needs to be good, and now you punish anyone who reminds you of what you gave up. This one goes deeper. You encounter someone callous, cutting, capable of inflicting pain without flinching, and you feel a visceral rejection. I would never. I'm not like that. Jung spent decades confronting this denial in himself and in his patients, especially after witnessing what ordinary people were capable of during the Second World War. Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote in his book, The Gulag Archipelago, "If only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. That line runs through you as well. Cruelty is not foreign to you. It lives in every sharp thought you suppressed, every revenge fantasy you entertained, every moment you wished someone would suffer for what they did to you. You are capable of cruelty. Every human is. The people you see as cruel are carrying your projected capacity for darkness. And here's the danger. The more you deny this capacity, the more likely it is to leak out in ways you don't recognize. In cold silences, in cutting remarks, in the righteous cruelty of someone certain of their goodness. Dostoevsky captures this perfectly. In Notes from Underground, he wrote, "Every man has some reminiscences which he would not tell to everyone, but only to his friends. He has others which he would not reveal even to his friends, but only to himself, and that in secret. But finally, there are still others which a man is even afraid to tell himself." Your capacity for cruelty belongs to that final category. And as long as it stays there, you will keep seeing monsters everywhere, never recognizing that the monster has your fingerprints. Now here's where it turns. You've been assuming the shadow is dark, that this work is about confronting your inner monster, but that's only half the story. The golden shadow. Jung didn't only write about the dark contents of the shadow, he insisted, repeatedly, that we exile our light with equal force. Your creativity, your ambition, your power, your joy, your sexuality, your brilliance. Robert Bly gave this phenomenon its name, the golden shadow. We not only put our shadow, our evil, into the bag, but also our good, our creativity, our genius, our ability to love. Think about someone you admire intensely, someone whose talent awes you, whose presence commands a room, whose freedom makes you ache. That ache, it's projection too. You're not seeing their light, you're seeing your light reflected back because you can't recognize it in yourself. Robert Johnson, in his book, Owning Your Own Shadow, explains, "We often project our own golden shadow onto others, especially those we admire most intensely. We see in them what we dare not see in ourselves." The golden shadow is often harder to reclaim than the dark. It's one thing to admit you have rage. It's another to admit you have greatness. So here's where you are. The arrogant, the lazy, the selfish, the cruel, and the brilliant, creative, powerful one you've never let yourself become. All of them mirrors. All of them you. But till now, you've been thinking about this as a personal problem, your shadow, your projections, your triggers. But it doesn't stay personal, because you are not the only one projecting. Your family projects, your community projects, your nation projects. And when millions of people project their shadows onto the same target, when an entire culture finds a shared enemy to carry its disowned darkness, something else emerges. Something far more dangerous. The shadow becomes collective. And collective shadows don't just ruin relationships. They build concentration camps. They start wars. They turn neighbors into monsters. You thought the shadow was your private burden. It's not. It's the engine of history. The shadow doesn't stop at the border of your skin. It scales. Groups have shadows too. Nations, religions, political movements, entire civilizations. And when groups project their shadows, the consequences are catastrophic. Let's think about how nations construct enemies. A country builds an identity, a story about itself. We are good. We are righteous. We are chosen. We are civilized. This is the collective persona. But every national persona casts a national shadow, the aggression, the greed, the cruelty, the bloodlust that don't fit the story. And that shadow needs somewhere to go. So the nation finds a target, an enemy, a scapegoat. They are the threat. They are the savages. They are the ones contaminating our purity, threatening our way of life, undermining our greatness. The enemy carries the nation's disowned darkness, and once the projection is complete, anything becomes permissible. The historian and psychoanalyst Robert J. Lifton studied this phenomenon in extreme ideologies. In The Nazi Doctors, he documented how ordinary physicians participated in genocide by splitting off their humanity. The individual could maintain two separate selves, one that engaged in monstrous acts, and another that remained decent and continued ordinary life. This is the shadow at the cultural level. An entire society, convinced of its goodness, externalizing its darkness onto a designated other. The immigrants, the heretics, the infidels, the enemy tribe. In his book, The Undiscovered Self, Carl Jung says, "The change of character brought about by the uprush of collective forces is amazing. A gentle and reasonable being can be transformed into a maniac or a savage beast. One is always inclined to lay the blame on external circumstances, but nothing could explode in us if it had not been there." Every genocide, every holy war, every mass persecution follows the same psychological script. A group that cannot face its own shadow finds a scapegoat to carry it. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You belong to groups. You have a family, political tribe, a nation, a generation, a race, a gender, a religion, or a rejection of religion. Every single one of these groups has a shadow. And if you're not actively examining it, asking what are we denying, what are we projecting, who are we scapegoating, then you are participating in the projection. You are part of the machine. Your hands are not clean. You see this in smaller scales too. Jung saw this coming. He wrote, "The great problem of our time is not in the hydrogen bomb. The great problem is in the human soul. We know nothing about the soul, and we teach nothing about it. The bomb is just a symptom. The wars are just symptoms. The atrocities are just symptoms. The disease is the unintegrated shadow, both personal and collective, running the show from the darkness. And here's the devastating truth. You cannot fix the collective shadow by fixing other people. You cannot protest it into submission. You cannot vote it away. You cannot educate it out of the population. The only place you can integrate the shadow is in yourself. One person, one psyche, one confrontation at a time. Jung put it directly. If you imagine someone who is brave enough to withdraw all his projections, then you get an individual who is conscious of a pretty thick shadow. Such a man knows that whatever is wrong in the world is in himself. Whatever is wrong in the world is in yourself. This is not guilt. This is the only way out. Now you have a choice. You can take this information and do nothing with it. Or you can descend into your own darkness, into the parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime avoiding, into the confrontation that every fiber of your ego will resist. There's a reason most people never do this work. It's not because they don't understand. It's because the descent asks something of you that feels impossible. It asks you to die before you die. If shadow work is so important, if it's the key to freedom, to wholeness, to ending the cycles that imprison us, then why doesn't everyone do it? Why do most people live and die without ever confronting what lies beneath the surface? The answer is simple. It's terrifying. The ego is not just a concept, it's a survival system. It's the structure you've built over a lifetime to navigate the world, to maintain relationships, to function. Your ego is your identity, the story you tell yourself about who you are. And the shadow threatens to destroy that story. To confront the shadow is to admit that you are not who you think you are, that your virtues have dark twins, that your certainties are defenses, that the person you've presented to the world and to yourself is incomplete at best. This doesn't feel like growth. It feels like death. The psychologist and philosopher Ernest Becker, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, argued that much of human behavior is driven by terror, specifically, the terror of confronting our true nature. Man is literally split in two. He has an awareness of his own splendid uniqueness, and yet he goes back into the ground to blindly and dumbly rot and disappear forever. Becker argued that most of human civilization, our religions, our achievements, our ideologies, is an elaborate defense against this unbearable truth. We build walls against our own mortality, and behind these walls, the shadow also lurks. This is why the defenses are so violent. When someone gets close to your shadow, when they name a quality you've disowned, when they hold up the mirror, watch what happens. You attack, you deflect, you rationalize, you minimize, you counteraccuse. You explain why they're wrong, why they don't understand, and why your situation is different. Freud cataloged these maneuvers. He called them defense mechanisms: denial, projection, reaction formation, rationalization, displacement. Each one serves the same purpose: to protect the ego from information it cannot integrate. And interestingly, this insight alone is not enough. Jung understood the ego's cunning. In Psychology and Religion, he wrote, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. The ego will create anything, anxiety, distraction, even illness, to avoid the real confrontation. It will lie, even to itself, especially to itself. You can read every book on the shadow. You can nod along to every word of this. You can understand the theory perfectly, and it won't matter, because the ego is always one step ahead. It turns even your self-awareness into another defense. I've done the work," the ego whispers. "I understand the shadow. I'm not like those unconscious people." And the shadow smiles in the dark, untouched. So what happens if you never do this shadow work? What is the cost of a life lived in avoidance? You keep encountering the same patterns, the same relationship dynamics, the same conflicts, the same failures. Different faces, different contexts, same underlying script. You leave one job because of a toxic boss, and find the same dynamic at the next company. You end one relationship because of a partner's flaw, and find that flaw magnified in the next partner. You cut off one toxic friend, only to attract another. Jung called this the repetition compulsion, a concept he developed alongside Freud. The unconscious recreates unresolved patterns over and over until they are finally made conscious. Those relationships you keep destroying aren't bad luck. They're the shadow's curriculum, lessons you refuse to learn, returning in endless variation until you finally pay attention. If you don't integrate your shadow, you will spend your life fighting phantoms. You will find enemies everywhere. You will exhaust yourself in the battles that were never real. You will push away the people who could love you and cling to the people who confirm your wounds, because the enemy was never outside you. The enemy was a part of yourself, disowned, projected, attacking you from 1,000 borrowed faces. Remember what Jung wrote in Ion. Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. We discussed this earlier, but now you can feel what it actually means. A world full of opponents, all wearing your own face. That's the life of the person who never confronts their shadow. Every interaction becomes a battlefield. Every relationship becomes a mirror they refuse to look into. Remember, the shadow contains not only your darkness, but your light, your exiled creativity, your buried ambition, your abandoned joy. If you never integrate the shadow, you never reclaim these parts of yourself. You live a diminished life, a life within safe boundaries, a life defined by what you're not rather than what you are. You become a fraction of yourself, and you never even know what you lost. The analyst Robert Johnson puts it starkly in owning your own shadow. To own one's shadow is to reach a holy place, an inner center, not attainable in any other way. To fail this is to fail one's own sainthood and to miss the purpose of life. To miss the purpose of life. That's what's at stake. Not comfort, not success, not happiness. Meaning, the thing that makes a life worth living. Here's the truth no one tells you. You will meet your shadow eventually. If not through conscious work, then through crisis, through breakdown, through the collapse of everything you built on a false foundation, midlife crises, divorces, mental health collapses, career implosions, spiritual emergencies. These are often the shadow, breaking through the ego's defenses by force. What you will not face voluntarily, you will face involuntarily, and by then, the price is catastrophic. Jung saw this pattern in countless patients. He wrote in Psychology and Religion, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. If it is repressed and isolated from consciousness, it never gets corrected. The longer you wait, the denser the shadow becomes. The more it accumulates, the more violently it will eventually erupt. You are not avoiding the confrontation. You are delaying it and increasing its cost. There's a reason the ancient myths are full of descents into the underworld. Orpheus descending for Eurydice, Inanna stripping herself bare as she goes down, Dante entering the inferno, Christ harrowing hell. These aren't just stories, they're maps. Maps for the journey you've been avoiding your entire life. The descent is not destruction. The shadow doesn't want to annihilate you. It wants to be seen. It wants to come home. It has been waiting in the dark, patiently, desperately, since the day you first learned to split yourself in two. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The door is in front of you now. You've always known it was there. The only question that remains is this: will you open the door? Or will you die with your wholeness still buried in the dark? A life half lived, a self half known, a song you never let yourself sing. The shadow is waiting. It has always been waiting. And for the first time, you know its name. So how do you actually do this? How do you take back what you've exiled? How do you integrate a part of yourself you've spent a lifetime denying? It begins with a radical shift in perception. Every trigger is a teacher. That person who irritates you, they're not your enemy. They're a messenger, delivering information about your own unconscious. The stronger your reaction, the more important the message. This is the practice. The next time you feel that familiar charge, the tightness, the judgment, the disproportionate irritation, try to stop. Don't act on it. Don't vent about it. Don't build your case against the other person. Instead, ask yourself 3 questions. What am I seeing in them? Where does this quality live in me, even in a small, hidden, or inverted way? What did I have to exile in myself to have this reaction? This is not easy. The ego will resist. It will offer 1,000 reasons why this situation is different, why your judgment is justified, why this person really is the problem. Let those objections arise, and then return to the questions. The goal is not to excuse bad behavior. Some people are harmful. Some actions are wrong. They deserve condemnation. Shadow work doesn't mean becoming a doormat or abandoning discernment. But it does mean separating 2 things that are usually fused: the reality of the other person and the charge that comes from your own projection. You can hold someone accountable and investigate your own shadow. You can set a boundary and ask what this situation is teaching you. These are not contradictions. They are the mark of an integrated person, someone becoming whole again. The analyst Robert Johnson offers a simple but profound practice in owning your own shadow. To honor and accept one's own shadow is a profound spiritual discipline. It is whole-making and thus holy. Whole-making, holy. This is not self-indulgence. It's not wallowing in your darkness. It's the opposite. It's claiming your darkness so it no longer controls you from the unconscious. When you can say, yes, I have the capacity for selfishness. Yes, I have the capacity for rage. Yes, I have the capacity for cruelty. Not as confession, not as guilt, but as simple acknowledgement of your full humanity. Something shifts. The energy you spent repressing these qualities gets released. The vigilance required to maintain the persona relaxes. The projections lose their power because you've taken back what you were projecting. Jung described this process as making the darkness conscious. He writes in book, Modern Man in Search of a Soul. How can I be substantial if I do not cast a shadow? I must have a dark side also if I am to be whole. You cannot be whole without your shadow. You cannot be fully human while denying part of your humanity. The integration is not about becoming your shadow. It's about including it, holding it, knowing it as part of yourself without being possessed by it. This is the paradox. By embracing the darkness, you stop being controlled by it. By acknowledging your capacity for destruction, you gain the freedom to choose creation. A whole person is someone who knows their darkness. A whole person doesn't project their unfinished business onto every relationship. They can see others more clearly, because they're not looking through the fog of their own disowned self. A whole person has access to their full range. The aggression they once repressed becomes assertiveness. The selfishness becomes self-respect. The ambition becomes purpose. The sexuality becomes aliveness. Nothing is destroyed. Everything is transformed. And something else happens. Something you don't expect. When you integrate your own shadow, you develop compassion for the shadow in others. The people who used to trigger you, you start seeing them differently. Not as villains, as humans, struggling with the same fragmentation, fighting the same war, losing in the same ways you once lost. You recognize their shadow because you've met your own. This isn't weakness. It isn't naivety. It's the hard-won compassion of someone who has walked into their own darkness and returned. James Hollis writes in the Eden Project, "The quality of all our relationships is a direct function of our relationship to ourselves. What we do not know or wish to avoid in ourselves will be visited upon those around us. And the reverse is true. What you do know in yourself, what you have faced, becomes the foundation for genuine intimacy, for real connection, for relationships built not on mutual projection, but on mutual wholeness. This is the gift of shadow work, not just healing yourself, but breaking the chain. The patterns you inherited from your parents, your culture, your wounded ancestors, they don't have to pass through you to the next generation. The cycle can stop here. The projections can end with you. You become what Jung called an ancestor worth having. So here's an exercise. Think of one person who triggers you, one person you judge, resent, or cannot forgive. Hold their face in your mind and ask yourself, honestly, without defense, what are they carrying that belongs to me? You don't have to answer now. But let the question live in you. Let it work on you. Let it follow you into your next conflict, your next reaction, your next moment of righteous certainty. This question, sincerely asked, is the beginning of everything. Your shadow is not your enemy. It's the lost child of your psyche, waiting to be welcomed back. Back home. And home is not somewhere you go. Home is something you become. When you open the door, step through, and say to the darkness waiting in the dark, I see you. I know you. You're me. Come in.